Imagine a world where the most powerful air force ever assembled in human history did not officially exist. Where the men who dropped atomic bombs on Japan, who firebombed Dresden, who flew through walls of flak over occupied Europe, were still technically soldiers. Not airmen. Soldiers. Imagine winning the greatest war in human history and coming home to find that the weapon that arguably did more to end that war than anything else, the airplane, the bomber, the fighter, the strategic air campaign, still belonged to an army that had been fighting wars on foot since the days of muskets and bayonets. That was the reality in 1945, and it was a reality that a group of visionary, battle-hardened, fiercely ambitious men were absolutely determined to change. What followed was not just a bureaucratic reshuffling. It was a revolution, a political war fought in the corridors of the Pentagon, in the halls of Congress, in the Oval Office, and in the pages of newspapers across America. A war between tradition and the future, between the old world of cannon and cavalry, now transformed into tanks and infantry, and a new world of jet engines, nuclear warheads, and the terrifying, unlimited reach of air power. This is the story of how the United States Air Force was born. This is the story of the men who fought for it, the men who opposed it, and the world that made it necessary. Buckle in, because this story is one of the most dramatic, consequential, and overlooked chapters in the entire history of American military power. To understand why the creation of the United States Air Force in 1947 was such a monumental moment, you have to go back. Way back. Not to 1947. Not even to World War II. You have to go back to a cold December morning in 1903 on a windswept beach at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, where two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, changed everything. Orville and Wilbur Wright did not just invent a flying machine that day. They unknowingly started a clock, a countdown to the moment when the air above a battlefield would become just as important, perhaps even more important, than the ground below. The military establishment of the early 20th century did not see it that way. Not at first. When the United States Army Signal Corps purchased the Wright military flyer in 1909 for the staggering sum of $30,000, they thought they were buying a reconnaissance tool. Something to look down from, not something to strike from. The idea that an airplane could be a weapon, a decisive weapon, a war-winning weapon, was so radical, so far outside the conventional military thinking of the time, that the men who believed it were often laughed at, dismissed, or worse, court-martialed. And that brings us to the most important figure in the entire prehistory of the United States Air Force. A man so far ahead of his time that his own government put him on trial for being right. His name was Billy Mitchell. Brigadier General William Lender Mitchell was a man who had seen the future and refused to pretend otherwise. Born in 1879, Mitchell came from a privileged family. His father had been a senator, and he could have coasted through a comfortable military career playing it safe, collecting promotions, attending banquets. Instead, he became obsessed with the airplane, obsessed with the idea that air power would transform warfare so completely that nations which ignored it would simply cease to exist as military powers. He served in World War I and came home absolutely convinced that the airplane had changed everything. He watched as the Army brass dismissed his ideas. He watched as Navy admirals insisted their battleships were unsinkable, untouchable from the air, and he decided to prove them wrong in the most spectacular, undeniable way possible. In 1921, Mitchell arranged a series of bombing tests against captured German warships. The Navy was certain the experiment would vindicate them. Battleships, they argued, were simply too big, too armored, too powerful to be sunk by aircraft. What happened next stunned the world. Mitchell's bombers sent the Ostfriesland, a supposedly unsinkable German battleship, to the bottom of the ocean in 21 minutes. 21 minutes. The Navy was furious. The Army was uncomfortable. The politicians were confused. And Billy Mitchell was delighted. He went further. He gave speeches. He wrote articles. He called out the leadership of both the Army and the Navy publicly, calling them incompetent and almost treasonable in their neglect of American air power. In 1925, they finally had enough. The Army court-martialed him, charged him with insubordination, found him guilty. He resigned his commission rather than accept the suspension. He spent the rest of his life writing and lecturing about air power, and he died in 1936, a decade before he was proven spectacularly right by a war that vindicated everything he had ever said. Billy Mitchell did not live to see the United States Air Force. But without Billy Mitchell, there might not have been one. After Mitchell's court-martial, the fight for an independent Air Force went underground. It did not disappear. It could not disappear because the technology kept advancing, the world kept changing, and the strategic realities kept screaming for attention. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the Army Air Service, which became the Army Air Corps in 1926, struggled for resources, struggled for respect, and struggled most of all for strategic identity. Who were they? What were they for? Were they just flying artillery, close air support for the army below? Or were they something fundamentally different, something that operated independently, struck targets hundreds of miles away, broke an enemy's industrial capacity, and won wars from above? This question, this fundamental, defining question, would dominate the internal culture of American military aviation for 2 decades. And it would produce 2 things that proved absolutely critical to the eventual creation of an independent Air Force. First, it produced a doctrine. And second, it produced a school. The doctrine was strategic bombardment. The idea was elegant and ruthless. Instead of attacking armies in the field, which was expensive, slow, and bloody, strategic bombers would fly over those armies and strike the factories, the oil refineries, the railroads, the power plants, the industrial infrastructure that kept those armies fed, armed, and moving. Break the infrastructure, and the army collapses without ever being directly engaged. It was the ultimate expression of air power as an independent, war-winning force. It was also deeply controversial, deeply difficult to execute, and as World War II would brutally demonstrate, far more complicated in practice than in theory. But as a doctrine, it gave the Air Corps something to fight for. It gave them a reason to exist beyond serving the infantry. It gave them a strategic identity. The school was the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama. And if any single institution deserves credit for shaping the intellectual and cultural foundations of the future United States Air Force, it is that school. Through the 1930s, as Europe lurched toward catastrophe and Asia erupted in war, the instructors and students at Maxwell Field debated, argued, theorized, and wargamed. They developed concepts like the self-defending bomber formation, the idea that a tight formation of heavily armed bombers could fight its way to a target and back without fighter escort. They refined the doctrine of precision daylight bombing, the idea that American bombers could hit specific, critical industrial targets with enough accuracy to cripple an enemy's war economy. These theories were not perfect. The war would reveal their flaws in devastating fashion, but they represented something far more important than tactical doctrine. They represented a belief system, a conviction that air power was not a supporting arm, but a decisive, independent force. And the men who graduated from Maxwell Field carried that belief system into World War II, into the Pentagon, and ultimately into the congressional hearings that created the United States Air Force. The man who more than any other translated that belief system into institutional reality was Henry Harley Arnold, known universally as Hap, a nickname that reflected his cheerful, energetic personality. Arnold was one of the original military aviators in American history. He had learned to fly from the Wright brothers themselves in 1911. Let that sink in. The man who commanded the largest air force in human history during World War II learned to fly from Orville and Wilbur Wright. He had survived the early years of military aviation, survived the political battles of the Mitchell era, survived the budget cuts and the institutional skepticism of the interwar period, and emerged in the late 1930s as the commanding general of the Army Air Corps. When World War II began, Arnold was perfectly positioned to do something extraordinary. He took a service that was vastly underprepared for global war, and within 3 years built it into the most powerful air force the world had ever seen. More than that, Arnold understood something that the pure warriors around him sometimes missed: that the fight for an independent air force was not just a wartime fight. It was a political fight, an institutional fight, a fight that had to be won in Washington as surely as the war had to be won in the skies over Germany and Japan. Throughout the war, while managing the greatest military aviation campaign in history, Arnold was simultaneously laying the groundwork for what would come after. He cultivated relationships with politicians. He gathered data, mountains of it, on the effectiveness of strategic bombing. He commissioned studies and reports that would become the intellectual ammunition for the post-war independence argument. He was building his case while building his Air Force, and he never confused the two missions. The war itself did more to make the case for an independent Air Force than any political argument ever could. The statistics were simply staggering. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the Army Air Forces, as they had been redesignated in 1941, numbered more than 2 million men and women. They operated over 70,000 aircraft. They had flown millions of combat missions. They had dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on Germany, Italy, Japan, and occupied territories across 2 hemispheres. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, whatever its limitations and controversies, had played a decisive role in destroying the Luftwaffe, disrupting German industrial production, and stretching the Wehrmacht to the breaking point. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, a single-night raid conducted by hundreds of B-29 bombers, killed more people than either atomic bomb. And then there were the atomic bombs themselves. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 superfortress called Enola Gay dropped a single bomb on the city of Hiroshima and killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly. 3 days later, another B-29 called Boxcar dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The war was over. And the lesson that air power advocates drew from those 2 missions was both simple and overwhelming. 1 airplane, 1 bomb, 1 city, end of war. If that was not the argument for an independent air force, nothing was. But winning the war in the air was not the same as winning the battle in Washington. The Army had powerful institutional interests in retaining control of its air forces. The Navy had its own air arm and was not about to surrender it to some new service. Congress was thinking about cutting military budgets, not creating new bureaucracies. And President Harry Truman, who had inherited the presidency on the death of Roosevelt in April 1945, was facing a set of competing pressures that made military unification the most politically complicated issue on his desk. Understanding what happened in 1947 requires understanding those competing pressures. It requires understanding Truman's strategic vision, the Navy's fury, the Army's ambivalence, and the sheer bloody-minded determination of the air power advocates who refused to take no for an answer. It also requires understanding a document that almost nobody outside of military history circles has ever read, but which changed the history of the United States more profoundly than most pieces of legislation that everyone has heard of. The document was called the Brewster-Henshaw Report. Actually, let us back up slightly, because before we get to any specific report, we need to understand the broader context of military unification, which was the political framework within which the independence argument was made. Military unification was the idea, popular among reformers and efficiency advocates after World War II that the fractured American military establishment, with its separate Army and Navy departments, its overlapping missions, its inter-service rivalries and wasteful duplication, needed to be rationalized into a single, unified structure. The war had demonstrated, sometimes painfully, the costs of poor coordination between services. The disaster at Pearl Harbor was partly a failure of coordination. The island-hopping campaign in the Pacific had been complicated by constant turf battles between the Army under MacArthur and the Navy under Nimitz. And the European theater had required an entirely new layer of command structure, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, precisely to impose coordination that the existing structure could not provide organically. Unification was the solution. But what form should unification take? This was the question that consumed Washington from 1945 to 1947, and it was within that question that the fate of an independent Air Force would be decided. The Army's position was relatively straightforward. They favored a strong, unified command with a single Secretary of Defense and integrated General Staff. They also, not coincidentally, were willing to accept an independent Air Force as part of the package, because they calculated that a unified structure with strong central control would actually give the ground-dominated Army more influence over overall defense policy than the existing fragmented system. General Dwight Eisenhower, who became Army Chief of Staff after the war, was a strong supporter of unification and of Air Force independence. His wartime experience had convinced him that air power was a genuinely independent strategic instrument, and his political instincts told him that supporting the airmen was the price of their cooperation in the broader unification project. The Navy's position was far more complicated and far more emotional. The admirals of the post-World War II United States Navy were not fools, and they were not simply defending parochial interests, though they were certainly doing that too. They had genuine, substantive, strategic arguments against the model of unification being proposed. They feared, with some justification, that a unified structure dominated by the Army and a new independent Air Force would result in the Navy being reduced to a subordinate role, its budget cut, its mission restricted, its hard-won wartime glory forgotten. They had their own air arm, naval aviation, which had been absolutely decisive in the Pacific War. The battles of Coral Sea, Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf had all been decided by carrier-based aviation. The Navy's aviators had no intention of being absorbed into or subordinated to some new Air Force controlled by former Army generals who thought in terms of strategic bombardment and knew nothing about carrier operations, anti-submarine warfare, or naval fire support. Beyond the institutional self-interest, the Navy had a strategic argument. They argued that strategic bombardment, the core mission of the proposed independent Air Force, was not the silver bullet its advocates claimed. The bombing surveys from Europe were already showing that German industry had proved more resilient than expected, that German civilian morale had not collapsed under bombing as the theorists had predicted, that the actual decisive effect of air power in Europe had come from tactical operations, from air superiority over the battlefield, from interdiction of supply lines, from close air support of ground forces. The admirals were not entirely wrong. These were real issues. The debate over the effectiveness of strategic bombardment is one of the longest-running arguments in military history, and it has not been definitively resolved to this day. But in 1945 and 1946, the atomic bomb had scrambled all of these arguments, because if you accepted that strategic bombers carrying atomic weapons were the ultimate deterrent against future wars, then the strategic bombardment argument was not just vindicated, but elevated to an entirely different level. And the Army Air Forces had the bombers. The Navy did not. Into this complex, bitter, high-stakes political battle stepped a man who would prove to be the crucial link between the wartime Air Forces and the independent peacetime service. His name was Carl Andrew Spaatz, and in September 1947, he would become the first Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. Spaatz was not the most charismatic figure in this story. He was quiet, reserved, a chain smoker who preferred poker games to speeches. But he was arguably the most professionally formidable. He had commanded the strategic bombing campaign against Germany in the final year of the war, directing the operations that finally broke the Luftwaffe and shattered Germany's ability to produce the fuel, fighters, and equipment needed to continue fighting. Then he had transferred to the Pacific and commanded the final strategic bombing campaign against Japan, including the atomic bomb missions. He had more experience commanding strategic air power at the highest level than any man alive, and he was absolutely committed to independence. When Hap Arnold retired in early 1946, citing the serious heart disease that had plagued him through the final years of the war, Spaatz became the commanding general of the Army Air Forces and the leading advocate for independence within the military establishment. He was the right man for the moment. Not a visionary like Mitchell, not a builder like Arnold, but a patient, shrewd, enormously credible professional soldier who knew exactly what he wanted and exactly how to get it. The political process that led to the National Security Act of 1947 was not quick or clean. It was a 2-year battle of proposals, counter-proposals, congressional hearings, presidential interventions, and inter-service feuding that produced one of the most complex pieces of legislation in American military history. The Navy, led by Secretary James Forrestal, a brilliant, driven, ultimately tragic figure who would later become the first Secretary of Defense and die by suicide in 1949, fought the unification proposal with everything it had. Forrestal was not opposed to some form of coordination. He was opposed to a strong, centralized structure that he believed would subordinate the Navy to Army and Air Force priorities. He was also personally skeptical of the strategic bombardment doctrine and worried that an independent Air Force would consume defense resources at the expense of the naval capabilities that he believed were essential to American security in the emerging Cold War environment. The fight between Forrestal and the unification advocates, particularly Army Secretary Robert Patterson and the Joint Chiefs, played out in a series of congressional hearings in 1945 and 1946 that featured some of the most remarkable testimony in the history of American civil-military relations. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations during the war, testified against unification. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the hero of the Pacific, testified against it. These were not small figures. These were the men who had commanded the greatest naval force in history, and they were telling Congress that unification as proposed was a mistake. It was an extraordinary spectacle. President Truman was not a military man in any deep sense. He had served as an artillery officer in World War I, but he had no experience with high command, no deep familiarity with the intricacies of military strategy, and no particular instinct for the nuances of inter-service rivalry. What he did have was an extremely clear political mind, a strong sense of presidential authority, and an almost instinctive preference for efficiency and economy. He wanted unification because he believed it would make the military more efficient and less wasteful. He wanted an independent Air Force because he believed, as most Americans did after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that strategic air power with atomic bombs was the foundation of American security in the post-war world. And he wanted a settlement of the inter-service feud because the constant public squabbling between the Army and Navy was embarrassing, politically damaging, and he believed strategically dangerous at a moment when the United States was beginning to confront a new and formidable adversary in the Soviet Union. The Cold War was beginning, and in the Cold War environment, the argument for a powerful, independent strategic air force was not just a military argument. It was a political argument of the highest order. The Soviet Union had a massive land army. It had experienced battle-hardened ground forces that had destroyed the German Wehrmacht in the greatest land campaign in history. The United States could not match that army in a direct ground confrontation without mobilizing the kind of resources that the American public, exhausted by 4 years of World War, was in absolutely no mood to provide. But the United States had something the Soviets did not have in 1947. It had the atomic bomb, and it had the bombers to deliver it. Strategic air power with nuclear weapons was not just a military option. It was the military option, the only affordable, politically sustainable way to deter Soviet aggression without a massive standing army. The argument for an independent air force and the argument for containment of the Soviet Union were, at the deepest level, the same argument. Give us independence. Give us the resources. Give us the B-29s and the atomic bombs, and we will make the Soviet Union afraid to move. That was the case that Spatz and his colleagues were making, not just to Congress and the president, but to the American people through every speech, every press release, every carefully orchestrated public demonstration they could arrange. The compromise that eventually emerged from the 2 years of fighting was not entirely what anyone had wanted. The National Security Act of 1947, signed by President Truman on July 26, 1947, was a document full of deliberate ambiguities, carefully hedged provisions, and political concessions that left several fundamental questions unresolved. But it did 3 things that mattered enormously. It created the position of Secretary of Defense, a civilian official who would coordinate the military departments, but, crucially, did not have direct command authority over them. This was the Navy's most important victory. They had feared a military superstructure that would override their departmental autonomy. The first Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal himself, was powerful but not omnipotent. Second, the act created the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency, fundamentally restructuring the American national security apparatus in ways that would define the Cold War. Third, and most important for our story, it established the United States Air Force as an independent, co-equal military service, separating it from the Army and giving it its own secretary, its own chief of staff, its own budget, and its own identity. On September 18, 1947, less than 2 months after Truman signed the act, the United States Air Force formally came into existence. Carl Spaatz was sworn in as the first chief of staff. Stuart Symington, a Missouri businessman and political ally of Truman's, became the first Secretary of the Air Force. The moment that Billy Mitchell had been court-martialed for demanding had finally arrived. But let us be precise about what had actually been created, because the National Security Act was more a beginning than an end. The new Air Force had its independence, but did not yet have the resources, the doctrine, the organizational structure, or the strategic clarity that independence required. Several critical questions had been explicitly left unresolved by the act itself, to be worked out later through what were called the Key West Agreement and the Newport Agreement of 1948. Who controlled land-based aviation? That was easy, the Air Force. Who controlled carrier-based aviation? Also easy, the Navy. But what about strategic bombing? Could the Navy develop its own long-range bombers to deliver atomic weapons? The Air Force said absolutely not. That strategic nuclear delivery was their exclusive mission. The Navy said the whole point of their new supercarrier program was precisely to give them that capability. What about close air support of ground forces? The Army wanted organic air support. The Air Force wanted to control all air power. What about airlift? Transport aviation? Air defense of the continental United States? These were not abstract questions. They were fights over money, mission, and influence that would continue for years after the formal independence was established. The creation of the Air Force on September 18, 1947 was the beginning of an argument, not the end of one. The world into which the new United States Air Force was born was one of accelerating danger and breathtaking technological change. The Soviet Union, though not yet a nuclear power, was known to be pursuing the bomb with every resource at its disposal. In August 1949, less than 2 years after the Air Force became independent, the Soviets successfully detonated their first nuclear device, and the American monopoly was gone forever. The Cold War, which had begun as a political and economic confrontation, instantly became an existential nuclear standoff. And the Air Force, with its bombers and its bombs, was suddenly not just the most powerful military service in American history, but the organization upon which the survival of Western civilization was understood to depend. The Strategic Air Command, established in 1946 under General George Kenney and dramatically reinvigorated beginning in 1948 under the extraordinary leadership of General Curtis LeMay, became the centerpiece of American strategic power. LeMay, who had commanded the B-29 bombing campaign against Japan and who is one of the most complex, controversial, and fascinating figures in the entire history of American military power, transformed SAC from a poorly organized, inadequately trained force into a precision instrument of terrifying efficiency. He was brutal, demanding, and absolutely uncompromising, and he built the organization that deterred nuclear war for 4 decades. Curtis LeMay deserves his own chapter in this story, because understanding the early Air Force requires understanding LeMay. He was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1906, the son of a laborer, and he pulled himself up by sheer force of will, intelligence, and an almost inhuman capacity for hard work. He became a military pilot in the early 1930s, when military aviation was still a small, struggling enterprise, and he devoted himself to the technical and operational challenges of long-range precision bombing with an intensity that bordered on obsession. By 1943, he was commanding the 8th Air Force's bomb groups over Germany, and he made his reputation with innovations in formation, flying, and bombing tactics that significantly improved both accuracy and crew survival. Transferred to the Pacific in 1944, he took over the B-29 campaign against Japan throughout the doctrine of high-altitude precision bombing when it proved ineffective against Japanese industrial targets, and switched to low-altitude night firebombing with devastating results. The Tokyo raid of March 9th and 10th, 1945 remains one of the deadliest single air raids in history. LeMay was not sentimental about what he did. He was coldly, brutally pragmatic. If it worked, he did it. If it did not work, he found something that did. When he took over Strategic Air Command in October 1948, he found an organization that he considered dangerously unready. In his assessment, which he stated with characteristic bluntness, SAC could not have executed a successful nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. He set about changing that with a ferocity that terrified his own people almost as much as it was meant to terrify the Soviets. Unannounced exercises, realistic training missions, ruthless standards of maintenance and readiness, a culture of absolute professionalism that demanded perfection and tolerated no excuses. Within a few years, SAC under LeMay was a genuinely formidable force, and the Air Force, as the service that housed and sustained SAC, claimed the dominant position in the American military hierarchy. That dominance came at a price. The other services, particularly the Navy, did not quietly accept the Air Force's claim to primacy. The period from 1947 to 1950 saw a series of bitter inter-service conflicts that are collectively remembered as the Revolt of the Admirals. The immediate trigger was the cancellation of the Navy's new supercarrier, the USS United States, in April 1949 by Secretary of Defense Lewis Johnson, who had replaced the mentally exhausted Forrestal earlier that year. Johnson was a close ally of Truman's and was implementing a defense budget that was being squeezed hard as the administration tried to balance fiscal responsibility against security demands. The supercarrier was canceled in favor of additional B-36 bombers for the Air Force, and the Navy exploded. Senior naval officers publicly accused the Air Force of pursuing the B-36 for corrupt reasons, alleging that the Air Force Secretary and private contractors had colluded to win the contract. They argued that the strategic bombardment doctrine was fundamentally flawed and that the Air Force's claims for the B-36 were wildly exaggerated. They produced a document, anonymously written but widely circulated, called The Revolt of the Admirals, attacking Air Force strategy and Air Force honesty with unprecedented directness. It was an extraordinary public breach of military discipline, and it ended careers. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Louis Denfeld, was fired by Truman for supporting the naval officer's public dissent. The supercarrier stayed canceled. The Air Force kept its B-30 SIXS. And the fundamental question of service roles and missions was papered over by the Newport Agreement rather than genuinely resolved. Then came Korea, and Korea changed everything. The Korean War, which began in June 1950 when North Korean forces invaded South Korea, was the first great test of the new American military structure created by the National Security Act of 1947. And in many ways, it was a profoundly humbling test. The strategic bombardment doctrine that the Air Force had made central to its identity proved largely irrelevant in a limited war fought in a mountainous peninsula with a relatively primitive industrial base. What proved essential was tactical air power, close air support of ground forces, air interdiction of enemy supply lines, and air superiority over the battlefield. These were exactly the missions that the Navy and the Marine Corps had argued for, and that the Air Force had, in its enthusiasm for strategic bombing, somewhat neglected. Korea forced the Air Force to fight the kind of war it had been least prepared to fight, and it demonstrated, for the first time in the Cold War era, the limitations of nuclear deterrence as a general-purpose solution to all security problems. You could not drop an atomic bomb on North Korean infantry attacking the Pusan perimeter. You needed fighter bombers, you needed close air support, you needed ground attack aircraft and the pilots trained to fly them. The Air Force had all of these things, but it had allowed them to atrophy in the rush to fund the Strategic Air Command and the nuclear delivery mission. Korea was a wake-up call, a brutal, bloody, ultimately inconclusive wake-up call that cost more than 36,000 American lives and produced a final outcome that looked disturbingly like a stalemate. But even as Korea was demonstrating the limits of strategic air power, the technology that was rapidly transforming the Air Force was making those limits ever more complex to navigate. The jet age had arrived. The first American jet aircraft, the Bell XP-59A, had flown in 1942, but the airplanes that would define the early Cold War Air Force were the swept-wing jets of the late 1940s and 1950s. The F-86 Sabre, which entered service in 1949, was the Air Force's first swept-wing jet fighter, and it proved its worth dramatically in the skies over Korea, where it met the Soviet MiG-15 in the first large-scale jet-versus-jet air combat in history. The kill ratio favored the Sabre by a significant margin, and the pilots who flew it became the last of the old-fashioned fighter aces in the tradition that stretched back to Eddie Rickenbacker in World War I. On the bomber side, the B-47 Stratojet, which entered service in 1951, represented a quantum leap beyond the propeller-driven B-29 and B-50 that had defined the early SAC. Swept wings, jet engines, a clean, elegant design that could cruise at altitudes and speeds that made interception by contemporary fighters nearly impossible. And following the B-47 came the B-52 Stratofortress, which first flew in 1952 and entered service in 1955, an aircraft so capable and so adaptable that variants of it are still flying combat missions in the 21st century. The B-52 is one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in the history of aviation, and its longevity is a testament to the foundational strength of the Air Force that was built in those turbulent years from 1947 to the mid-1950s. The Air Force of the early 1950s was also wrestling with a set of organizational and cultural questions that went beyond hardware. What kind of institution was it? What were its values? What was its identity separate from the Army it had left? The Army had tradition, history, a cultural heritage going back to Valley Forge and the Civil War and the Indian Wars. The Navy had the sea and a tradition of independence and individual command that went back to John Paul Jones. The Marine Corps had its esprit de corps and its fiercely cultivated mythology of amphibious assault and warrior excellence. What did the Air Force have? It had, above all, the airmen, the pilots, the men who had flown the Spitfires over Britain, the Thunderbolts over Germany, the B-17s through the flak over Schweinfurt, the B-29s over Tokyo. Men whose experience of war was as technically demanding, as psychologically complex, and as physically dangerous as anything experienced by infantrymen in the trenches or sailors on submarine patrol. Building an institutional culture out of that experience, creating a service identity that could hold together pilots, bombardiers, navigators, ground crew, radar operators, intelligence officers, and all the other specialties that made an Air Force function was not a simple task. The Air Force deliberately cultivated certain myths and certain heroes. Billy Mitchell was rehabilitated and honored. The Doolittle Raiders, who had launched a dramatic bombing raid on Tokyo from a carrier deck in April 1942 and were among the most celebrated aviators of the war, became founding figures of the new service's mythology. The Tuskegee Airmen, the African-American pilots who had served with such distinction in World War II despite facing brutal racial segregation, became a source of both pride and embarrassment, their excellence undermining the justifications for the very segregation they had endured. In 1948, President Truman signed Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces, and the Air Force moved to implement it more rapidly than the other services, partly for reasons of genuine principle, partly because the skills of black aviators were too valuable to waste on racial ideology. The question of nuclear weapons and their custody was another front on which the early Air Force had to fight. In the immediate post-war years, atomic bombs were not the property of the military at all. They were under the control of the Atomic Energy Commission, a civilian agency, and the military had to formally request access to them. The arrangements for transferring the bombs to military custody in a crisis were complicated, time-consuming, and in the view of Curtis LeMay and his colleagues at Strategic Air Command, potentially catastrophic in a scenario where a Soviet first strike might leave only minutes for a retaliatory response. The Air Force fought hard for custody of its own weapons. The argument was military and operational. You cannot run a credible deterrent, LeMay argued, if your weapons are locked up in civilian storage facilities and require paperwork to retrieve during crisis. The Atomic Energy Act was modified, custody arrangements were renegotiated, and over time the Air Force gained the operational control of its nuclear arsenal that it needed to make deterrence credible. This was not a trivial bureaucratic achievement. It was a fundamental shift in the relationship between civilian authority and military capability that would define the American nuclear posture throughout the Cold War. There were also the missiles. By the mid-1950s, the development of ballistic missiles capable of carrying nuclear warheads was rapidly becoming the central technological challenge in the arms race with the Soviet Union. The Air Force claimed the strategic missile mission as its own, arguing that ballistic missiles were simply a different delivery system for the same strategic nuclear mission that bombers had been performing since 1945. The Army, with its tradition of rocketry going back to the V-2 program and enriched by the German rocket scientists it had recruited after the war under Operation Paperclip, including Wernher von Braun himself, disputed this claim vigorously. The Navy wanted its own submarine-launched ballistic missiles. The resulting fight over who owned the missile mission was every bit as bitter as the original fight over Air Force independence, and it was still being fought when Sputnik changed everything in October 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the world's first artificial satellite, using a rocket that everyone understood could also deliver a nuclear warhead to any point on the American continent. The political and strategic pressure to accelerate American ballistic missile development became irresistible. The Air Force's Atlas and Titan ICBM programs, already underway, were dramatically accelerated. The Navy's Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile program went from concept to deployed system in an extraordinarily compressed time frame. And the space race, which Sputnik had suddenly made real and urgent, opened an entirely new dimension of competition between the services, between the nation, and between the superpowers. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the birth of the Air Force in 1947 was not technological. It was strategic. The decision to create an independent Air Force was simultaneously a decision about how America would fight the Cold War. It was a bet that air power, specifically nuclear air power, was the foundation of American security. It was a bet that the combination of overwhelming destructive capability and the credible willingness to use it would deter Soviet aggression more effectively and more cheaply than a massive standing army. It was a bet on deterrence. And for 4 decades, that bet paid off. The Soviet Union and the United States never fought each other directly. The nuclear standoff that Churchill called the balance of terror held precariously but stubbornly through Berlin, through Korea, through Cuba, through Vietnam, through the collapse of détente and the Second Cold War of the 1980s, until the Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991 and the world changed again. Whether the credit for that outcome belongs primarily to nuclear deterrence or to a complex mix of economic, political, ideological, and diplomatic factors is a question that historians will argue about forever. But the Air Force that was born on September 18, 1947, was the instrument of that deterrence, the organization that maintained the bombers and later the missiles that gave deterrence its credibility. Its creation was not just a bureaucratic event. It was a strategic choice that shaped the world. And it was a choice made possible by the courage and vision and sheer stubborn persistence of a remarkable generation of men. Billy Mitchell, who was right too early. Hap Arnold, who built the force that proved him right. Carl Spaatz, who fought the political battle with the same patient professionalism he had brought to the military campaign. Stuart Symington, who understood that the Air Force needed political advocates as much as it needed skilled pilots. Curtis LeMay, who turned the new service into an organization capable of doing what it promised. And thousands of others, the airmen who flew the missions, the engineers who built the planes, the ground crews who kept them flying, the women who served in the Women's Air Force Service Pilots program during the war and continue to serve in the post-war Air Force, gradually breaking down the barriers of gender discrimination as surely as their black colleagues were breaking down the barriers of race. These were the people who made the Air Force real. Not a theory, not a doctrine, not a piece of legislation, but an institution. A living, breathing, enormously powerful institution that has shaped American power and American history from 1947 to the present day. The story of the birth of the United States Air Force is a story about vision and how it collides with institutions. It is a story about the relationship between military power and political authority. It is a story about technology and how it changes not just what armies do, but what they are. It is a story about individual courage. The courage of men like Billy Mitchell who were willing to destroy their careers rather than lie about what they knew to be true. It is a story about collective determination, the long, patient, sometimes infuriating effort of an entire community of airmen to make their country understand what air power meant and what it required. And it is a story about consequences about how the decisions made in those crucial years from 1944 to 1950 rippled forward through decades of history, shaping the Cold War, the space race, the nuclear standoff, the interventions in Korea and Vietnam and the Gulf and beyond. Every time you see it be 52 in the sky, or a fighter jet screaming over a stadium on a flyover, or a news report about an American airstrike somewhere in the world, you're seeing the descendants of the decision made on September 18th, 1947. The decision that said air power deserved its own home, its own leadership, its own strategy, and its own future. The story of the Air Force did not end in 1947. In many ways, it was just beginning. The jet revolution, the missile age, the space age, the digital revolution, stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, unmanned aerial vehicles, all of these were chapters still to be written when Carl Spaatz put on his new uniform and accepted the title of First Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. But they were chapters made possible by what happened in 1947, by the vision, the struggle, and the ultimate triumph of the men and women who believed that the sky was not the limit. It was the beginning. So here we are, more than 75 years later, and the United States Air Force that was born in the shadow of the atomic bomb and the beginning of the Cold War has become something that even Hap Arnold, even Billy Mitchell in his most expansive visions, could not quite have imagined. It flies aircraft that can go 5 times the speed of sound. It operates satellites that make every other form of military power possible. It fields drones that can circle a target for hours before striking with a precision that would have seemed like science fiction to the crews who dropped conventional bombs over Germany from 25,000 feet. It commands nuclear weapons that dwarf in destructive power the bombs that ended World War II. It has fought in every American conflict since its creation, from Korea to Vietnam, from the Gulf War to Afghanistan and Iraq and beyond. And it continues to evolve, continues to adapt, continues to grapple with new technologies and new threats in a world that changes faster than any institution can comfortably manage. The Air Force of 2024 is wrestling with hypersonic weapons, with cyber warfare, with the militarization of space, with the rise of China as an aviation and space power, with the question of how autonomous systems and artificial intelligence will reshape the future of air combat in ways that no human pilot can fully predict or control. The questions are different from the ones that preoccupied Spaatz and LeMay and Symington in 1947. But the fundamental challenge is the same. How do you build an institution capable of mastering the most demanding technologies of your time, maintaining the most credible deterrent possible, and fighting and winning wars when deterrence fails, all while remaining accountable to the civilian democratic authority that gives military power its legitimacy? That was the challenge in 1947. It remains the challenge today. And understanding where the Air Force came from, understanding the birth pangs and the battles and the brilliant, flawed, extraordinary people who brought it into existence is essential to understanding where it is going. The sky that Billy Mitchell looked up at in the 1920s and saw the future of warfare is the same sky that F-35 pilots fly through today. The conviction that air power is not just a supporting arm, but a decisive, independent strategic force. The conviction that Mitchell nearly destroyed his career to assert, that Arnold spent a career building, that Spaatz spent 2 years fighting for in the corridors of Washington. That conviction has been proven right so many times in so many wars and crises and standoffs, that it has become one of the foundational truths of modern military history. The United States Air Force exists because those men were right. It exists because a generation of airmen refused to accept that the sky belonged to anyone other than those who were willing to master it. And it stands today, 77 years after its creation, as one of the most powerful and consequential military institutions in the history of human civilization. Not bad for a service that began as a department of the United States Army Signal Corps, buying one airplane from two bicycle mechanics for $30,000.